Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Chapter 3 of our theories on war and peace. We will have a look today on those theories that locate the major causes of war, that claim that they can explain why wars break out by looking at domestic politics. The second image, to quote Kenneth Walsh, the second level of analysis, if we use the term proposed by David Singer. In our introduction, we learned that I gave you the definition of Clausewitz, and Clausewitz considered war to be the mere continuation of policy by other means. Policy is the term I'm interested in, because in our chapter 2, last week, when looking at the question of the rationality versus the irrationality of wars, I told you that the word policy, used in Clausewitz's definition, war is but the mere continuation of policy by other means. The word policy used in this definition meant, I quote, the true appraisal of affairs, that is to say, the capacity of the statesman to perceive correctly, objectively, the environment, the situation that he had to cope with. The true appraisal of affairs. But Clausewitz proposes another definition of policy, another conception of policy. He defines it also as the intelligence of the personified state. Policy is the intelligence of the personified state. And this is the definition. This is the starting point, of today's chapter. What is the meaning of intelligence? Intelligence, of course, refers to the rationality of wars. What about personified? Policy is the intelligence of the personified state. Well, the expression personified, of course, refers to Clausewitz's basically realist approach of wars, in particular of international politics in general. According to realists, states are personified, embodied in the statesman. States are unitary actors whose decisions are taken by statesmen or stateswomen, that is to say, one single person acting in the name of the state. Which amounts to saying that when a statesman takes foreign policy decision, and when he undertakes foreign policy actions, and when he decides or she decides to go to war, of course, he is interested in promoting the national interest of the state. He personifies, he or she embodies the national interest of the state. And this is directly linked to the conception of realists, according to whom foreign policy is high politics. States on the international scene pursue the national interest, and this high politics, by definition, is different from, superior to domestic politics, that is to say, what realists call low politics. You see immediately the pejorative meaning, potentially at least, in the expression low when compared to high. And Clausewitz obviously explicitly shares this conception. Listen to Clausewitz in his On War treaty. Policy unites in itself and reconciles all the interests of the internal administrations, because policy is nothing else than the representative and exponent of all these interests towards other states. So all the domestic interests form a national interest. And when the state deals with another state, it promotes the national interest and not different societal interests, private interests, private preferences of specific groups within the states of the civil society. This is the general conception of Clausewitz, faithful to his realist assumptions. That said, Clausewitz conceives that the reality may be sometimes slightly different. Listen to Clausewitz, that policy may take a false direction. That policy may promote unfairly ambitious ends, private interests, the vanity of rulers, does not, I go on quoting, does not concern us here. For here, we, I, Clausewitz, can look only at policy as the representatives of all the interests of the whole community. If then we read this excerpt between the lines, which conclusion can we draw? We can deduce that according to Clausewitz, sometimes, policy, and therefore wars, may promote unfairly the ambitious ends, the private interests, and the vanity of rulers. Sometimes these objectives indeed are pursued rather than the national interest. But in Clausewitz's book, he will not look at these possibilities. He is not interested in doing so. He will focus on his general conception that most of the times, most states do indeed look for the national interest and not the private interests, the vanity of rulers, or the ambitious ends of said rulers. The book he's writing, in other words, he wrote it in the 1820s after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. He himself had been a general in the Prussian Army. In the book that he is writing, there is no place to take into account such a hypothesis. There is no place to deepen this point, which, however, is conceivable. Empirically, sometimes wars may occur because they satisfy private interests, ambitious ends, the vanity of rulers. But in his book, he prefers not to look at it. Because he considers, or he sticks to his basic conception that foreign policy and therefore wars promote the national interest rather than private interest. Let's now establish a link between this interpretation, this specific point within Clausewitz's analysis, and Bueno de Mesquita's findings that we saw last week. We saw last week that according to Bueno de Mesquita, roughly 75 to 80% of wars are rational, in the meaning that they permit the state launching the war to obtain satisfaction, that is to say, to compel its adversary to do what it wants it to do. But if roughly 3 wars out of 4, 4 out of 5 are irrational from this point of view, 1/5 or 1/4 of existing wars were not irrational in the mean that they did not have, when they were launched, the statesmen who launched them could not expect a positive utility. The question then, and this is the link between Bueno de Mesquita's findings and Clausewitz's possibility of wars fought for reasons other than the national interest, the link then is the following one. Maybe there are wars which, though being irrational from the expected utility model point of view, are there wars that, though irrational from the realist conception of war and foreign policy, may be rational for other reasons. may be rational in reference to the domestic context of the statesmen or the states initiating these wars. In other words, in today's chapter, ladies and gentlemen, we will take seriously the idea, the hypothesis that some wars may be due to domestic considerations. Decisions to launch these wars obey the domestic political context of different actors. We will see immediately which these actors may be, and they do not obey external considerations, that is to say, what is happening on the international scene. To put it differently, we will have a look at those theories claiming that the decisions to go to war may be due to various types of domestic interests rather than national interests. And we will look at, therefore, at those theories that claim that the major causes of wars should be looked for at the second level of analysis, the domestic political context, what Kenneth Waltz calls the second image. And actually, we will focus on two sets of theories of war, two sets. Imperialist theories of war, on the one hand, and so-called diversionary theories of war. The imperialist theories of war claim that wars pursue private societal interests, pretty often called sinister interest. But to use the expression sinister interest presupposes that he or she who uses this term acknowledges that there may be such a thing called national interest. It's compared to national interest that private interests are sinister. If you are liberal, strictly speaking, strictly defined, at least the non-state-centric liberal, you do not believe that there is such a thing called as national interest. So you just would say private interests, particular interests, specific societal interests of different groups. Anyway, the imperialist theories of war, and then a second set of theories of war claiming that domestic considerations sometimes explains why war break out, sometimes explain why wars break out. This second side is the diversionary theory of war, diversionary theories of war, claiming that wars sometimes are launched in order to pursue political profits, political advantages of the ruling class, or maybe should I say, the decision maker, the government, the administration. So let's have a look at these two theories, and we will logically start with the imperialist theories of war. The concept of imperialism is used by many scholars of different theoretical approaches. Chronologically speaking, Morgenthau, in the discipline of international relations, Morgenthau, in his Politics Among Nations, considers or defines imperialism as a policy aiming to overthrow the status quo. He distinguishes imperialist policies, foreign policies, from status quo foreign policies. Reymaron, in his Peace and War, considers imperialism to be the conduct of a political unit constructing an empire, that is to say, eager to subject foreign populations to its rules. These two authors are realists. There is a critical neo-Marxist third world favorable theory of imperialism due to Johan Galtung, the Norwegian peace researcher who used the expression structural imperialism to explain why the periphery goes on being dependent nowadays from the core, the center of the world economy. But I would say that the best known theories of imperialism are those that go back to roughly 1 century ago, a little bit more actually. That is to say, chronologically speaking, John Hobson, a liberal scholar who was the first to publish kind of scientific or an academic study of what he called imperialism in 1902. Then we have the Bolshevik leader Lenin himself, who in 1917, that is to say some months before the revolution broke out in Russia, wrote his very famous essay, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And 2 years later, in 1919, the Austrian sociologist, economist Joseph Alois Schumpeter wrote his theory on the exact title, and look at it. Contribution to a Sociology of Imperialism. So let's start with Lenin, though chronologically speaking, he's the second and not the first. Lenin proposed the Marxist conception of imperialism. The Marxist conception of imperialism claims that imperialism is intrinsic to capitalist development, to the capitalist development of economy. I quote Lenin, imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all the territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. Very quickly. According to Lenin, being a Marxist, the capitalist economy is regularly confronted with crises, contradictions, crises. These crises are due to what Marxists call the falling rate of profit. That is to say, the further the capitalist accumulation goes on, more and more the profit rate will fall. So what do capitalists do? They try to escape this trend. And in order to escape this falling profit rate tendency, first they merge various capitalist private firms, merge into larger units. These larger units at that time were called trusts. And they exert monopolies. That is to say, they dominate the market of the product, which is theirs. And then, after merging into larger units, monopolies, trusts, we would call them multinational firms to some extent, they search for new markets, of course. They search for new markets in order to find less expensive raw materials and in order to find new consumers for their goods. So they try to enlarge the population buying their products. According to Lenin, these new markets, where they will find both new consumers but also less expensive raw materials, these markets exist in the colonial territories of the then capitalist states, that is to say the Western European states plus the United States. These new markets exist in the colonial territories, and therefore, first, the capitalist states wage wars to conquer these territories in order to dominate them politically. A more general point, you see here that for Lenin and therefore for Marxists, states, when waging wars, look for the satisfaction of the specific interests of the capitalist class, the bourgeois class, those who own privately the firms that managed in becoming monopolies or trusts. In other words, for Marxists, the state is not an independent unitary actor above the society, looking for the national interest. The state defends the specific interests of the dominating class, the dominant class, the capitalist or bourgeois class, detrimental to the proletarians. So capitalist states fight colonial wars to conquer new territories, synonymous with new markets for their own bourgeois class. The colonial cake, however, cannot grow eternally. That is to say, sooner or later, the whole world will be dominated by various capitalist states. And since the colonial cake cannot grow perpetually, capitalist states become contenders, competitors. That is to say, the growth of the different states' markets cannot go further without armed conflicts opposing the different capitalist states against each other. And according to Lenin, World War I was such an imperialist war, the consequence of the rivalry, the colonial rivalry opposing the French, the British, the Russians, the Germans, eager to dominate the world, to divide the world, to distribute the colonial territories, the zones of investment and of finance capital. So World War I is a logical conclusion, a logical crowning of the crises that regularly characterize the capitalist accumulation. Lenin's theory, fairly successful in the discipline of international relations among leftist scholars in the 70s, neo-Marxists, third world theorists, is no longer successful, for the very simple reason that it is not empirically corroborated. Let's look at World War I. World War I opposed two rigid alliances, the Triple Entente to the Triple Alliance. The Triple Entente, that is to say, the British, the French, the Russians, versus the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Italy. As a matter of fact, Germany indeed, with its Weltpolitik, its world political ambitions, launched by Emperor William II, Wilhelm II. Germany obviously indeed was a colonial rival of both the French and the British. In Morocco, for instance, regarding the French, in Central Africa regarding the French and the British. They were eager to conquer their own colonial territory. So to some extent, the opposition characterizing World War I between the French and the British on the one hand, and the Germans on the other hand, makes some sense. But we all know, of course, that the French and the British themselves were rivals in the Middle East, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. We know that the British were the colonial rival of the Russians in Central Asia, today's Afghanistan, where the Great Game opposed the British Empire to the empire of the Russian Tsar. Now, these colonial rivalries did not prevent the British and the Russians on the one hand, the British and the French on the other hand, to form one single coalition against the Germans. In other words, we can hardly ascribe the emergence of the two coalitions to their colonial rivalries, because within the Triple Entente, the fact for the states, the colonial powers, to be rivals in their colonial territories did not prevent them from becoming allies when it came to cope with what was perceived as the German threat. In other words, the economic rivalry in the Third World, in the then colonial territories, it was not called Third World yet, sorry for this confusion. The then colonial rivalry cannot explain World War I. What's more, according to Lenin, basically, the war broke out because of the colonial rivalry, because of the importance, by definition, the economic importance of the colonial territories. It is thanks to the conquest and domination of these territories that the capitalist states, according to Lenin, the capitalist states were looking for to come out of, to find a solution to that crisis, thanks to their investments in these new markets of the colonial territories. But if we look at the empirical figures, the empirical data, at the beginning of the 20th century, the economic importance of the colonial markets was very small. The capitalist firms, the trusts, the monopolies, investments did not take place in the colonial territories of the different states. They took place in other capitalist states. Great Britain, the British firms, first and foremost invested in the US. France was not even the first investor in its own colonies in Africa, the Near East, or Southeast Asia. And last but not least, the basic assumption of Marxists. There are general crises which will end up in the final crisis of capitalism, which will permit socialism to prevail, the revolution to break out, and socialism or communism to prevail. Of course, this basic assumption is absolutely refuted by empirical reality. Yes, there are pretty often capitalist crises. There was one in 1929, there was one in 1973, the oil crisis, a new one occurred in 2008. We are now living the economic crisis as a consequence of the coronavirus crisis. So yes, capitalism is crisis-ridden. But up to now, the future will tell us, of course, but up to now, capitalism always was able to overcome these crises. So the myth of a final crisis, obviously, is hardly convincing. The Marxist theory of imperialism, therefore, can be neglected as a kind of, it is not convincing in order to look for explanations of why sometimes wars break out. Let's therefore look at the liberal conception of imperialism. The first author to propose such a liberal version of imperialism, and actually the first author to propose a theory of imperialism, is the British liberal John Hobson. Imperialism, a Study is the title of the book, published in 1902, based on the Anglo-Boer War, the British war opposing the British in roughly today's South Africa, to the Boers, that is to say, to those people that had established themselves in today's South Africa and who were of Dutch origin. Boer means peasant, farmer, it comes from the German Bauer. And these Dutch descendants, the descendants of Dutch colons, were eager to become independent. They create their own states. Later they were called Afrikaner, and they established the apartheid regime, but this is not directly linked to our topic here. So the British launched the Anglo-Boer War in 1898, and it is this specific war that is analyzed by Hobson. Hobson was also a friend of John Maynard Keynes, and they became important economists after World War I in proposing their theory of the welfare state and of the regulation of international economics. So let's look at the explanation of John Hobson. John Hobson starts his analysis in a pretty similar way as Lenin. Actually, Lenin was influenced by Hobson because Hobson wrote his book in 1902 and Lenin wrote his Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism in 1970. So the starting point of John Hobson is the crisis of the British economy, the crisis of the British economy of the 1890s. And according to Hobson, this crisis was due to underconsumption, which led to overproduction, and to exceeding savings capacities. This is what economists call capital surplus, concretely. According to Hobson, British capitalists, British private owners of industries, underpaid their working classes in order to make more money, in order to have a high profit rate. Problem, however, if you underpay your workers is that they are poor. So if they are poor, they cannot buy the goods that are produced by the industries. If these goods are not purchased, there will be overproduction. There is no need to go on producing, since the products that are produced, nobody has money enough to buy them. So if there is no need to produce, there is no need to invest, and therefore there are exceeding savings capacities. This leads to a crisis. In order to kind of vicious circle. In order to get out of this vicious circle, Hobson proposes, and this is a Keynesian recommendation. Keynes will adopt the same recommendation, the same practical political advice. According to Hobson, in order to get out of this vicious circle, the capitalist class, the private owners, should increase the wages paid to the working class. By increasing the wages, the purchasing power of the working classes would increase too, and they could buy the products that they cannot yet buy, etc., etc. In this case, consumption would increase. Overproduction would gradually disappear, and there would be new opportunities to invest. But, and here then we come to the specific imperialist dimension of his analysis, but according to Hobson, the British capitalists do not want to increase the salaries, the wages paid to the working classes, because of their somehow aristocratic mentality. They do not want to share the wealth which they consider to be theirs with the rest of the population. They want to remain richer than the rest of the population. And therefore they look for another solution, and this other solution consists in conquering new markets overseas and in asking the British government to defend these new markets, if necessary, by military interventions. And it is precisely the military intervention of the British to try to maintain the British dominance in South Africa against those Afrikaners who are eager to become independent from Great Britain. It is this war that the British fought to satisfy the specific interests of those capitalists that, according to Hobson, did not want to raise the wages of their working men. So at first sight, this explanation is pretty close, pretty similar to Lenin's theory of imperialism. But there is one very significant, important distinction. Lenin has a determinist vision of imperialism. Imperialism is inherently a product of capitalism. It is the necessary stage, the highest stage of capitalism. Capitalism cannot but lead to imperialism. This is not Hobson's conception. Hobson actually reintroduced agency. Imperialism is the consequence of the behavior of one specific part of the society, the minority of capitalists who actually are more close to aristocrats than to capitalists. Imperialism, the fact to conquer new territories or to defend overseas territories, to prevent them from becoming independent, these imperialist wars are due to the behavior of some a minority of specific individuals who want to defend their private and therefore their sinister interests. Sinister because different from the interests of the majority of the population. Listen to John Hobson. Imperialism, irrational from the standpoint of the whole nation. Imperialism, irrational from the standpoint of the whole nation, is rational enough from the standpoint of certain classes. Classes was a term used at that time. Today we would say certain parts, certain groups. Although the new imperialism has been bad business for the nation, it has been good business for certain classes within the nation. The vast expenditure on armaments. To fight wars, you need weapons. The costly wars, you raise taxes. The risks of foreign policy, because, of course, you will have rivalries with other colonial powers. The checks upon political and social reforms in Great Britain, if you invest a significant part of your GDP in military expenditures rather than in, you cannot focus on social progress, social reforms. So all these negative consequences, though constituting a great injury to the nation, have served the present business interests of certain industries and professions, of a minority of private societal groups. Imperialism, according to Hobson, is the consequence of a policy pursuing the interests of one specific group, of various specific groups, rather than the whole nation. And the same analysis will be put forward by Schumpeter, the Austrian economist and sociologist, in 1919, immediately after World War I, 2 years after Lenin's essay. Schumpeter's essay is called Contribution to a Sociology of Imperialism. Schumpeter was a kind of hardcore liberal scholar, absolutely convinced that capitalism is a force of peace. Capitalism and free trade favor peace. Why? Because, according to Schumpeter, capitalists need to predict the economic activity in order to invest. It is rational to know what will happen. In other words, they need a regular growth, a predictable evolution of the economy. And therefore, they do not like wars, because wars may bring them sudden profits, a sudden increase of their profits. But it will shake up the regular evolution and the predictable evolution, the predictable growth of national economies. Therefore, capitalists are favorable to peace. This is the analysis of Schumpeter. Schumpeter, however, of course, was witnessing the outbreak of World War I. There is therefore a kind of contradiction. How can you explain World War I if capitalists are favorable to peace? And capitalists in 1913, 1914 were favorable to peace because of the interdependency of the then existing British, German, French, notably, economies. Well, Schumpeter looks for another explanation. He also looks for one specific group, which, according to him, is responsible of why World War I broke out. And according to Schumpeter, World War I was neither due to capitalism in general, as claimed by Lenin. It was not either due to various specific capitalist groups, as Hobson would have said if he had applied his analysis to World War I. No, according to Schumpeter, World War I is due to a atavistic, that means outdated, old-fashioned, ancient class of aristocratic landowners in Germany, and notably in Prussia. Prussia was at the origin of the German unification. The so-called Junkers. Junkers in Germany were agrarian landowners. And they also dominated the Prussian and then the German army. The huge majority of officers of the German army came from this specific social class, aristocratic landowners. According to Schumpeter, these landowners, and therefore generals and the officers of the Prussian army, had contributed to the German unification. They actually were at the origin of the rise of Prussia as a significant political unit in Europe. Maybe you know that after 1648, the 30 Years' War, won by the French, won by the Dutch, and also won by Sweden, which at that time was a major power, the Swedish troops occupied the northern part of today's Germany. That is to say, the territory going from Berlin to the Baltic Sea. And in order to get rid of them, to expel them from what they considered, rightly so, to be their territory, what did the Prussians do? They created the very efficient Prussian army. And those who fought in this army were the Prussian aristocrats. So these Prussian aristocrats, according to Schumpeter, were useful and necessary when Prussia was created, when Prussia gradually became more and more important in then Holy Roman Empire, and when Prussia unified Germany by defeating the Austrians in 1866 and by defeating the French Napoleon III in 1870. But gradually, after 1870, because of the rise of capitalist economies and economic interdependence between the different capitalist economies, the Prussian landowners and their contribution to the Prussian army were no longer socially useful. In other words, they became marginal in the new modern capitalist world, and therefore, to some extent, eager to still be important, eager to survive as a privileged class within the new society. They had an interest in convincing the German emperor to launch World War I. World War I, therefore, was due to the search of the private interests of a specific societal group, the Prussian Junkers, the Prussian aristocratic landowners. They needed this war to try to prove that they still had a social utility in the contemporary world, in the then contemporary world, capitalist, economically interdependent, the so-called first globalization. So if we sum up, Hobson and Schumpeter, they agree on one major point: imperialist wars are due to the sinister, parochial, private interests of a minority of societal actors who benefit from such wars and who therefore exert the pressure upon the government to fight to launch these wars. And the government accepts to do so because the costs of the war will be supported, will be paid by the rest of the society. And the rest of the society, therefore, will not protest against these wars. Schumpeter's and Hobson's theories are very attractive, but there is one point which is lacking in their demonstration. How is it possible that in the then modern societies, be it Great Britain at the end of the 19th century, be it Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, how is it possible that in such modern societies, a small minority group manages to shape the government's policy? How can we explain that this minority succeeds in shaping the foreign policy of a government, at least indirectly accountable to the majority of the population. Hobson and Schumpeter do not propose, I would say, detailed analysis of this, a detailed response to this question. But they give some indications. Hobson, for instance, claims that British imperialists exercise a control over the body of public opinion through the press. Through the press. In other words, media somehow contribute to shape what the majority of the population believes, which amounts to saying that media manipulate public opinion. And Schumpeter, he claims that the minority of Prussian landowners managed to convince the then German emperor by doing what? By establishing an alliance with some representatives of the capitalist class. These ideas, the role of press and the existence of alliances between specific groups and other more significant groups in society, these ideas will be deepened 3 generations later by an American author, Jack Snyder, who in 1991 published his book, Myths of Empire, the subtitle Domestic Politics and International Ambitions. Snyder is a kind of, he's a realist, but he's a neoclassical realist. That is to say, he considers that some political decisions are due to the pressure of civil society, exerted by the civil society upon the decision makers, upon the state. This is neoclassical realism. So starting point of Snyder is that very regularly, different states of whatever domestic regimes are tempted by what he calls imperial temptations. They cannot resist imperial temptations. This was the case of the British Empire in the 19th century. This was the case of Imperial Germany, World War I. It was the case of USSR in the 60s and 70s when they intervened militarily in Africa, etc., notably in Southeast Asia, even in Afghanistan. This is the case for Imperial Japan during the 30s when they extended the Japanese empire, the Asian sphere of co-prosperity. And it was the case, of course, of the US during the Vietnam War. The book was published in 1991, and Snyder updates his book in 2003. He integrates the war, the military operation called Operation Iraqi Freedom of George W. Bush against Iraq in 2003, which, according to him, also fits his analysis. So what then does this analysis consist in? According to Snyder, imperial temptations, that is to say, imperial undertakings, the fact for major powers to wage imperialist wars overseas, though their security is not at stake, etc. These imperial undertakings are due to myths of empire, to imperial myths, that is to say, to the belief, but it is a wrong belief, according to which the national security starts far away. The myth according to which these wars must be waged in order for the state to preserve its security. And actually, according to Jack Snyder, these myths of empire are put forward by the, I quote, the propagandistic activities of imperialist groups. The propagandistic activities of imperialist groups. These groups are able to hijack the government's foreign policy in 2 ways. First of all, these groups form coalitions in order to obtain the majority during the decision-making process. And according to Snyder, this is what happened very concretely in 2003. The George Bush administration was divided into three groups. The realists, pragmatists, Colin Powell, the then chief of staff, the head of all the American armies, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force. And also the then security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. They were realist pragmatists, favorable to war, but only if the UN adopted a resolution authorizing this war. And then there were, within the same administration, all people advising the ultimate decision maker, that is to say, George W. Bush himself. Second group was composed by the so-called Nationalist Hawks, the nationalist hardliners, the vice president, Dick Cheney, and the boss of the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, that is to say, I forgot his name, Rumsfeld, Donald Rumsfeld. Hardliners, that is to say, people who had been politically trained during the Reagan administration in the 80s, and who insisted upon America's capacity to defend itself. America is different from and superior to the Soviets. At the time, the Soviet Union was a threat or perceived as a threat, and therefore America should maintain its independence. And then there was a third group, the neoconservatives. Neoconservatives headed by number 2 of the Pentagon, that is to say, Paul Wolfowitz, and an advisor, Richard Perle, an advisor of George Bush. So 3 groups. And these neoconservatives also were persuaded, convinced of America's exceptionalism, but they had an offensive conception of this exceptionalism. That is to say, America should spread its values and not merely defend them with success. It should spread them, profit from the unipolar world structure in 2003 to impose its will upon those rogue states, such as Iraq, that threatened the stability, the regional stability. And by transforming these dictatorships into democracies, America's values would prevail and triumph all over the world. So there were 3 groups. What happened, according to Jack Snyder, not in this book, but in the article which applies his theory to Operation Iraqi Freedom? Well, the neoconservatives formed a coalition with the Nationalist Hawks, the Nationalist hardliners, in order to get rid of the realists. Because despite the neoconservatives being offensive and the hardliners being defensive, they had one common point. They did not want to respect the UN Charter, which Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice wanted to respect. So they were able to constitute a majority within the George Bush administration, and this majority convinced Bush, who then took the decision to launch the war. The neoconservatives and the Nationalist Hawks formed a coalition because they shared the same rejection of the UN, but also because they were the representatives of some specific societal interests. Societal interests, more specifically, of different American oil and engineering groups who wanted to profit from the war, to control the oil market in Iraq, and to reconstruct the destroyed industrial plants destroyed by America's war. The engineering firms made money thanks to this war. And of course, they also were the representatives of the corporate warrior firms the private soldiers, firms, if we can use this expression, corporate warriors, who contributed to the American invasion besides the official American troops, the American army. A coalition then, in order to favor their interests by getting rid of the inner opponents within the Bush administration. And according to Jack Snyder, these groups, these imperialist groups, also take advantage of the state's propaganda resources. That is to say, they are able to sell the myths of empire thanks to their networks with the media, with the think tanks, the role of think tanks in America, you know it. So they managed to diffuse, to spread those news thanks to specific media, not necessarily CNN, but first and foremost Fox News and different newspapers who did not play their role as the fourth estate, that is to say, as the fourth power besides the executive, legislative, and the judiciary power. Fourth power is supposed to bring information to the people, permitting people to make up their own opinion. This fourth estate did not exist because the media only, or the majority of the media, or those media that were read by the majority of the American population, were informed by those imperialist groups that had the capacity, that had an interest in waging the war. These groups, according to Snyder, had an interest in waging these wars also because of the political interests. The neoconservatives had an interest in spreading their own neoconservative ideology. And we thus come gradually to the second set of theories. Wars may be launched not merely to satisfy concrete material interests, but also political interests. Political interests no longer of specific societal groups, but political interests of political groups, of political parties, and in this case, more specifically, of the government itself, of the administrations themselves, those who launch the wars. This set of war is constituted by the so-called diversionary theories of war, also called the scapegoat theories. Let's have a look at the so-called diversionary or scapegoat theory of war. Probably the best book here is Amy Oakes's Diversionary War, subtitled Domestic Unrest and International Harm. According to the diversionary theory or theories of wars, the scapegoat theory, political authorities within the states, political governments, central governments, decide to go to war in order to benefit from political advantages. More specifically, the basic idea is the following one. Policymakers, presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, when confronted with various domestic difficulties, domestic unrest, economic breakdowns, social upheavals, political demands, civil disobedience, and of course, civil war. When policymakers are confronted with these difficulties, they try to cope with them not by satisfying the demands, neither by repressing these unrests, but by launching a war against an external adversary, an external enemy. This war, and this is the reason why they launch it, such a war is supposed to create what John Miller, if you look at the bibliography, what John Miller called in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, what he called the rally around the flag effect. The rally around the flag effect, that is to say, such a war is likely to recreate a national unity in favor of the political leaders. And these political leaders benefit from a renewed legitimacy. Their lost legitimacy will be renewed, will be recovered thanks to two mechanisms. First, by creating a front diverting, diversionary theory of war, by creating a foreign front diverting the people from from the domestic difficulties. First mechanism. Second mechanism, the legitimacy will be recovered thanks to the accusation of the enemy as being responsible of the domestic difficulty, the initial domestic trouble. According to those who accept this theory, there are many examples empirically corroborating the validity of this scapegoat theory. First of all, the examples that are given, if we go back to the past, the Falklands War, called Malvinas, Guerra de las Malvinas, by the Argentinians, because they considered the Malvinas to be their territories, whereas the British called them Falklands because they considered it to be theirs. This war has been explained as due to the desire of the then Argentinian dictators, the military junta. Galtieri was the then dictator in 1982, by the desire of General Galtieri to recover this territory, part of the British sovereignty, in order to divert the Argentinian population from the domestic troubles that had gradually emerged since the Argentinian junta, the military dictatorship, had come to power in 1976. And it is even, this diversionary theory is even put forward in order to explain the reaction of the then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She profited from Argentinian attack against one of the islands of the Falklands in order to recover her own lost popularity, because she launched the British Navy to defeat successfully the Argentinian troops that had invaded the Falkland Islands. And thanks to this victory, indeed, Margaret Thatcher gained the elections that she organized pretty soon after the victory. This will take place, it started, I remember, I think it was on April the 2nd, 1982. I was a student at that time. And you may know, if you are interested in football, in soccer, in 1982 took place the World Championship in Spain, won by the Italians. Italians sometimes win. And I think it was in the semi-final, no, in the quarter-final, Argentina was opposed to England. And Argentina won. And Maradona, who was the then star of the then Lionel Messi, if you know the contemporary best football player of the world, the then best football player was Maradona, also an Argentinian. And he marked a goal with his hand. And he claimed that this was the hand of God permitting Argentina to take a revenge against the British, a revenge of their defeats during this Falklands War. So, and first example is the Falklands War or Malvinas War in 1982. Another example is the Kipur War. Kipur War, actually, we should call it the October War, because it is from the Egyptian perspective that this war sometimes is considered to be a diversionary war. The October War was launched by Sadat in 1973 against Israel. and in order to recover the lost Sinai Peninsula, the Sinai territory lost in 1967. And some people, some analysts consider this decision to initiate a war by Sadat as an attempt by Sadat to become as popular in the eyes of the Egyptian population as the former leader of Egypt, that is to say, Colonel Nasser. The First World War, to some extent, by some historians, is considered to be a diversionary war, that is to say, emperor and no more an imperialist war. A diversionary war launched by the emperor to divert the German populations who were claiming for more social rights. At that time, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, more Marxist than nowadays, of course, provoked a lot of protests in order to improve its living standard, and in order to get rid of these protests. Emperor Wilhelm II, Emperor William II is supposed by those analysts who proposed this explanation, is supposed to have launched a war to divert the German population from the domestic demands. And another example is the Russian war against Japan in 1905. You know that Russia at that time was confronted with the very first kind of pre-revolutionary troubles. Trotsky was launching these troubles. So the then Russian Tsar may have been tempted to launch the war against the Japanese, all the more so he was sure that he would easily win. It was misperception. The Russians were crushed by the Japanese. We saw this last week. It is considered to be a diversionary war because the then Secretary of the Interior, Plehve is his name, is reported to have said, listen to this, in order to prevent a revolution, we need a quick, small, and victorious war. In order to prevent a revolution, we need a quick, small, and victorious war. The war was quick and small, but not victorious, and the revolution broke out a little bit later in 1917. So this idea that wars are fought to serve internal objectives of the statesmen themselves, not of private groups, is as ancient as political thought. The first political thinker to have considered this possibility was Machiavelli himself. He wrote, "A prince should be afraid of two dangers, one from within, coming from the subjects, the other from outside, coming from foreign powers." And this is what he wrote concerning his subjects, that is to say, the citizens, but at that time they were subjects because there were no democracies. Concerning his subjects, when affairs outside are not disturbed, he must fear that these subjects will conspire secretly. In other words, there is a risk of conspiration, of revolution, when there is no war fought against an outside danger. If then you reverse the quote, this means if you want to have peace, inner peace, civil peace, wage a war against an external enemy. And this is exactly and explicitly what Jean Bodin, the French political thinker of the end of the 16th century, wrote in his 6 books of the Commonwealth, les 6 livres de la République. Book number 5, this is what he wrote: the best way of preserving a state and guaranteeing against rebellion and civil war, the best way is to keep the subjects in amity with one another, in union with one another, and to this end, in order to maintain this unity, to this end, the best way is to find an enemy against whom the people can make common cause. If a people has a common enemy, it will not start a civil war, various groups against other groups within the same society. So there is a kind of centuries-old consensus among philosophers, also among more contemporary scholars. Quincy Wright shares the same idea. Quincy Wright, his book, A Study of War, I put it in the bibliography of the introductory chapter. There is a kind of consensus, but this consensus does not prevent criticisms from being raised against the diversionary theory of war. And these criticisms come from the more general sociology of conflicts, the sociology of conflicts of the German sociologist, one of the founding fathers of contemporary sociology, Georg Simmel. I put his book in the bibliography of today's chapter. And the more recent sociologist, an American one, Louis Kosa. They agree with the general principle that conflict with an out-group favors the unity of an in-group. And Simmel goes as far as writing, listen to Georg Simmel, an external war may be the ultimate way for a state to overcome inner divisions. An external war may be the ultimate way for a state to overcome inner divisions. But they do specify also two specific points, two important points. First, in order to maintain this unity, there is no need to a real war to take place. An imaginary threat of such a conflict, a non-conflict with an outgroup, an imaginary threat, can be, and will be sufficient to recreate the unity. There is no need to wage an effective war. And the second important precision that they make is the following one. The relationship between an external war and a domestic unity only works if the inner division at the origin of the decision to launch a war, if the inner division did not go too far. In other words, the inner divisions, the domestic unrests, does not, cannot, should not prevent the various groups to go on sharing the same values. If they do no longer share the same values, if they do no longer believe in the legitimacy of the whole group, then a war with an external enemy will not recreate the lost unity. These 2 points are pretty important if we apply them to the diversionary theory for. If it is true, then that an imaginary conflict is sufficient to recreate unity, there is no need to really effectively launch a war because of the costs of such a war, because of the risks of such a war. And this is exactly what happened in Argentina. The Argentinian junta, the dictatorship, the dictators, the military dictators in Argentina launched a war, but they lost it. In other words, there was a political cost that they paid, and they lost their rule in 1983, some months after the war, and a new general election permitted a civilian government to be re-elected. And if it is true that an inner cohesion must go on prevailing despite various domestic unrests, if this is true, then a statesman should not be tempted to look for an external enemy, because if in doing so, there is a risk of this enemy trying to exacerbate the inner division by supporting one of the factions that are opposed to those factions supporting the government. If then we consider these two limits, then we come logically to the conclusion that diversionary wars should not actually be that often launched by governments. First of all, governments should satisfy with what theorists call the political use of force. That is to say, they should tell the people that there is an enemy, but without necessarily going to war, because it is too risky. And all the more so, they should not wage effective wars, because there is a risk for them of losing the war due to the so-called fifth column supported by the enemy. This does not mean that there are not links at all between domestic considerations and wars fought against foreign enemies. Of course, there are such links. Of course, there are examples of wars profiting statesmen. Take Operation Desert Storm, launched by George Herbert Bush in 1991 against Iraq, guilty of occupying Kuwait. If you look at the popularity rate, the approval rate of George Herbert Bush, the father, in July 1990, before the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the approval rate was 60%. 60% of Americans who were asked the question in regularly organized opinion polls: do you approve or disapprove of the way George Herbert Bush is handling his job as a president? Do you approve or disapprove? 60% approved in July 1990. 74 approved after his decision to send American troops to the Saudi Arabian desert, Operation Desert Shield, the defensive part of the operation. 60 to 74 to 82 in January 1991, after the decision to launch the offensive Operation Desert Storm. 60, 74, 82, 92 after America's victory at the very end of February 1991. 92%. Never did an American president reach such an approval rate. 92% approved his way of handling his job as president. François Mitterrand in France profited from a similar increase of his approval rate. But neither Bush nor Mitterrand provoked the war. They profited from the war launched by somebody else. So it is not a diversionary war. It is a war which creates a rally around the flag effect, but it is a windfall profit. Bush, Mitterrand profited from the war that had been launched by Saddam Hussein. They seized, they grasped this kind of window of opportunity, but they did not tell Saddam Hussein, invade, so I will defend Kuwait and then my approval rate will increase. Of course not. What's more, if we look at Galtieri, the Argentinian military dictator, if we look at the German Kaiser, if we look at Sadat, if we look at the Russian Tsar, they were not democrats. They were autocrats. They were autocratic leaders. Autocratic leaders, however, are accustomed to repress politically. Why should they go to war? Logically, democratically elected leaders cannot afford to repress politically their opponents. So they should be tempted, all else being equal, to go to war because they cannot afford to repress politically. And if they cannot satisfy the domestic demands, they should be tempted to look for and to find an external enemy. But there is no example of democracies launching diversionary wars. There are no examples. To sum up these criticisms, the diversionary theory of war is not very convincing. At least as a general explanation, it's not convincing empirically. There are no examples of democracies launching such wars, though democracies, all else being equal, should be more interested. Democratic leaders should be more interested than non-democratic leaders in launching such wars. There are no empirical examples, and there is a kind of logical contradiction within the theory. And yet there are links between domestic situations and external wars. Let's take the example of the first Persian Gulf War, the one opposing Iraq to Iran from 80 to 88. Let's have a look at the chronological sequence. A civil war breaks out in Iran after the regime of the Ayatollahs came to power in 1979. In 1979, a civil war. In 1980, Saddam Hussein attacks Iran, thinking that he will profit from the divisions due to the civil war in Iran. From 1980, 81, 82 onwards, Iraqi's attack creates a rally around the flag effect in favor of the Iranian government because of the attack of Iraq. And in 1982, 1983, 1984, no more civil war in Iran. So the Iranian government profited from the war. But once again, it was not the Iranian government who had launched the war, the attack of Saddam Hussein against its own territory. It profited from this war to recreate the lost unity due to the Islamic Revolution. And therefore, we could actually come to the conclusion that in general, states should avoid launching wars in order to recreate national unity because of the potential negative impact of the foreign front upon the domestic situation. Look at Germany. Germany was unified in 1870 after its victory, after Prussia's victory against France and after Prussia's victory against Austria. Bismarck, after unifying Germany, thanks to his military victories, however, stopped his expansionist foreign policy. Why? Because he first needed to consolidate the domestic civil society. He had to concentrate on domestic policy. Another example, during the Peloponnesian War, Sparta was opposed to Athens. Sparta, during the war, was confronted by a kind of revolution, a revolt, a rebellion of its slaves. What did Sparta do? It negotiated a ceasefire with Athens to first get rid of the civil war, the rebellion of the slaves. So it focused, states focusing on domestic problems, focus on these domestic problems rather than they attempted to divert from these problems by launching external wars. And we thus come, last point of today's class, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience. The general conclusion then we can draw from today's chapter is the following one. There are some wars due to sinister, parochial, private, singular interests as opposed to national interests. There are some wars launched by specific leaders driven by domestic reasons rather than by external motivation. Just as we saw this last week, there are wars due to misperceptions or due to sociological constraints, organizational routines, standard behavior, standard patterns of behavior. There are such examples, but, and this is the conclusion, in general, war is not only a rational activity, as we saw last week, it is also, and this is the conclusion of today's chapter, I quote Clausewitz, it is a serious means to a serious end. States decide to go to war in order to obtain, to satisfy, to achieve a serious objective. Which objective then? Which serious end do states try to satisfy by going to war? Raymond Aron gives us the answer by distinguishing three objectives that states might be looking for when deciding to go to war: security, power, and glory. States go to war to guarantee their security, to exert their power, to pursue glory. Listen to the first argument. If we accept that war is not desired for its own sake, war is not an end in itself. This is the Clausewitzian conception of war shared by Remaro. If we accept that war is not desired for its own sake, the belligerent, he who launches the war, seeks to create, thanks to this war, conditions guaranteeing its security, guaranteeing that it does not need to fight in the future. We may say, therefore, that every state makes security a primary objective. States first look for security. But, second objective, collective units also seek to be strong, not merely to guarantee their security, but, I quote, to be powerful. That is to say, to be able of imposing their wills on their neighbors, on their rivals. States look for security and for power, defensive realism, offensive realism. And I would add, Remaro, I quote his third argument, I would add a third objective, glory. When the struggle is joined, there is danger that military victory in itself becomes the goal, causing political objectives, either power or security, to be forgotten. The desire for absolute victory is often the expression of a desire for glory more than of a desire for force. States look for glory, for prestige, for honor, for reputation when pursuing victories, not merely power or security. In our next chapters, then logically, we will look at first security as a cause for war, chapter 4. We will look at power, the distribution of power, systemic level of analysis, Kenneth Waltz's third image. We will look at power as a cause for war. And in our chapter 10, we will look at the non-material reason why states go to war, glory or identity, which may incite states to go to war or to maintain peace. This is the program of chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 10. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to today's class. I wish you a great day and hope you come back next week. Goodbye.